Okay, today we're going to tie a female Adams, which always kind of makes me laugh because the Adams isn't a real bug. It's really just a surging pattern that happens to catch a ton of fish. But it's got a green spot on the back representing an egg sac, and call it whatever you want. It catches a ton of fish. All right, so I've got 18-aught nano silk on here to kind of reduce the buildup, and this is a paired set of mallard wings. What I do when I want a thicker set of wings on my flies, I actually use two feathers. I butt them up against each other and even them up and get them tied in there. And I don't always use two feathers. Sometimes if I'm knocking out a bunch of flies, I'll just take one of the larger mallard feathers in the pack and just kind of, pluck off some even tips and use those for wings. But here I'll use two feathers, get those tied in and cut them at a taper. I try to get the tip of my taper about halfway from where the wings are tied in down to the tail. And then that way when I come down and, that rolled on me a little bit. But when I get that tied in, you can see that starts the taper that you want there. And it's no biggie. If it rolls on you can just roll it right back. For the tail, usually when I tie Adams, I'll use one of these cree feathers. I don't usually do the brown and the grizzly for the tail. The cree feathers will just, it's one shot, easy tailing material. It's much easier. So that's what I tend to use. So I'll get that tied right down about a hook shank in length. And again, one of the reasons why I love this nano silk is it's just such minimal buildup of your thread. It's fantastic. For the egg sac, I got a tiny little strand of chartreuse floss that I'm going to get that cinched in. We'll get that evened up. Now notice where I stopped pulling it through. As I go up the shank, those tips are going to line up right where my body is going to end. And all of that works together to kind of help build that taper a little bit. If I can just wedge these in there and kind of free that up. Now you can see where the edge of my cut line is. That little space there in front of that is the space that's being left for the hackle to be tied in. So again, everything is measured out, coordinated, cut at a certain spot for a reason. And I'm going to kind of come back down here. Now, if I start wrapping this floss right now, it's just going to start, pouring over itself. So I'm going to give it a good twist to make sure that it goes on as kind of one uniform thing, because all those strands will start to separate if you don't do that. So I'll get that wrapped around. Just 2 wraps, nothing more than that. You don't want to go too crazy. And we'll get that tied off. Good. And I'm gonna maintain all of that tension as I get this cut, because I want to cut it as close as possible, because the more material I leave up the body, the more it's going to mess up the taper that I've created. So I got that as close as I can, keeping that tension on there. And I'm going to get all that wrapped in there, not building up any more bulk, not screwing up my taper. And it looks like we're all good here. So to lock that in place, I'm going to use a little bit of thick UV resin. The thin would just kind of, I want there to be kind of like a little bit of a glow to it. So I like the thick. It's going to have a little bit of a bubble around it. And I use my bodkin here to kind of apply that, because I don't really want it spilling over onto the body or anything like that. I want it to just be right on the chartreuse tag. We'll zap that real quick. This little torch I picked up at the fly tying symposium, and I love it. It's a real direct shot. Really, really good torch. Now for my dubbing, one of the things, and I've mentioned this in other videos too, overdubbing is a huge problem that I see with dry flies. So I'm going to show you how I do that as soon as I get these wings tied up straight here. Nano silk is great because of the minimum thread buildup, but it does require a lot of wraps when you want to build a dam and get them things to stand upright. Some of these little shorter fibers that aren't really going to contribute anything to the wings, I'll just get right rid of those. So really what you want to do, because we use 2 feathers, it'll be pretty easy to see where one feather ends and another begins. So I'm just going to grab one feather and hold that tight is I run my thread through the middle, and that's going to split them evenly almost right away. And then after I get it in the middle, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a couple of wraps around the actual feather. That'll kind of help that side stand alone as a wing. And then I'll lock in my work after each turn. And then we're going to come around the front and lock in the second wing with a couple of wraps, lock it in. And if it folds back on you, don't worry about it. You can manipulate these. You can move them around as much as you want. They're actually pretty easy to kind of move around wherever you want them, so it doesn't have to be completely perfect. Got one more little strand in the front there, but it's not a big deal. Yeah. And if you got some that aren't cooperating, just get right rid of those. We're going to cover all that stuff up anyway, so it's no biggie. Come on. I think it is time for some new scissors. Okay. Now again, the dubbing is going to be just super fine Adam's color dry fly dubbing. And you can see on there, you can barely see that it's thicker than the thread. So I put a really, really, really thin noodle on there. Overdubbing a dry fly, it really makes it hard to work with. It makes it so that it doesn't give you the body that you want. I mean, every time I twist a little bit onto the thread, it's a tiny, tiny little wisp. I mean, you can almost barely see it on the camera. It's about that much. So we'll get all that on there. And another reason why I like the real thin noodles is as you go and wrap it up the shank, if you want to add a little bit or take a little bit off, you can do that and make adjustments, where if you have a real thick noodle, you're kind of stuck with what you got. So get my first wrap on there, and we're going to run this right up the body, and it's nice and tight. So with that real tight loop on there, or that real tight dubbing rope, you can really get in there and shape that body and have it follow the contour of the underbody you made, and make sure that you get that real nice smooth taper, which we have here. That body looks pretty good, and we're good to go. Now I'll use the traditional 2-feather, my grizzly and my brown. So what I'll do is I'm going to peel back to expose some of the barb to tie in. And on the top side, now the colorful side is going to be facing me. And the top side, I'm going to rip a pretty good strip off that. See how the top has more barbs pulled off? That's so that first wrap lays nice and perfectly around the shank and gets my hackle off to a really, really good start so that it stands up straight, doesn't splay all over the place. Makes for a much sharper looking fly. Couple wraps to hold it. We'll take the brown. We'll do the same exact thing. Remember, the colorful side facing you. And the top side, you're going to pull more barbs off than the bottom so that that first wrap lays nice and perfectly flat. It's a seemingly unimportant yet extremely important step. Get that wrapped in nice and tight. Bring it forward. And again, you need a little bit of bulk in the front because you haven't tied anything in the front. So I make sure that I bring my hackle stems almost all the way to the hook eye, because there is a pretty substantial difference there. After tying in your wings, you don't have any materials tied in at all near the eye. So I like to make sure that I bring that all the way towards the front. The first feather to wrap will be the second one that you tied in this case the brown. I'm going to get my pliers cinched on there, and the reason why is because it's going to sit a little bit further back, and then it'll wrap easier, and then the grizzly can come in right behind it. Slipped off. So I'll get my pliers on there, and we're going to go ahead and get that wrapped around. There's the first wrap. You can see the tiniest little bit of space behind that first wrap. That's going to be where the grizzly is going to go. And then as I go up the shank, see how I'm leaving a tiny, tiny little space? If you leave that little space, once you start wrapping the grizzly, that grizzly will slip right into that little space that you leave, and it'll slide in there nicely. I'll leave a little space behind the wings, move my feather to the front, Get a couple more wraps in the front, even though we're slipping down a little bit, but that should be fine. And hold the feather upright while you cinch it in with a wrap. Now, if you just leave this dangling right now, that brown feather is going to come out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a half hitch in there to kind of hold that. I'm going to just tighten it up a little bit. And we'll go ahead and get that cinched in right under there. And we're good. So now that we've saved our work, now that brown feather's not going anywhere. It's not going to loosen up on us. Anytime you wrap a double hackle, you want to make sure you secure that, or else it could just be a pain. So get this cinched in with the hackle pliers, get that first wrap going. It's going to go behind the brown. And now that we left that little gap, you just get that going in the first little gap there. And that feather is going to want to sit right into each one of those little notches that you left with the brown. That'll make for a real nice, full hackle. This thing will float like a cork. Get that over the top. And I'll show you how I clean up the head and make sure that it looks nice. Get that last wrap there. And notice I go all the way to the eye. You know, a lot of tires, they kind of leave a space there for the head. I'll show you how to create a nice head with carrying the hackle all the way through to the eye. So I'm going to get that cinched in. Get the feathers pulled up. Make one more real tight wrap to make sure that they're cinched in, not going anywhere. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull them back and build up a dam. Now, if you cut that, it's almost impossible to get that feather cut so that it's not spilling over the eye. But if you hide it amongst the head that you're going to make by tying it backwards, that's how you're going to build up a real nice head and get a real nice clean finish on a dry fly. So now I'm just going to kind of get those errant feathers out of the way. Be able to slip that thread right in there. Get a whip finish on there. And again, don't be afraid to stroke the feathers back and make sure that you're... I hate when I skip it over. Let me start this again. All right, there we go. Keep it tight. Get that notched in right under the hook eye. There we go. Get a few nice wraps in there. And there you go. Now, obviously the fly will fish just fine as it sits right now, but there's going to be a few little errant fibers here and there that I'm going to want to clean up and get rid of. And that nano silk is a really, really strong thread, which is why I always choose to cut it with a razor blade. Sometimes the scissors just have a real hard time getting that in there. And any of these errant fibers that are just splaying all over the place, don't be afraid to get right rid of them. I got one tail fiber kind of sticking up. If I can grab hold of that guy. I'll just snip it. It's the top of the fly. Fish don't care. There we go. And that's pretty much it. I mean, it's a regular Adams, but it's got that green little egg sac on it. It's a nice little touch that really adds a lot to it, and I'll tell you, it's a hell of a fish catcher. Hit like, hit subscribe, and there it is.